Greetings, loyal shinobi. Unsheath your blade and raise it in defense of your master, whose life is threatened by numerous unknown enemies. Cry in the dark night, that which will be the last thing your enemies hear, before your blade slides into their flesh, or clashes with their own before meeting an untimely end. You must push beyond the pain, the exhaustion, the desire to simply give in to despair, and the fact that your life will be filled with only bloodshed and sorrow. Rise once more, enter the shadows to stalk your prey, and send them to their final destination, because death, for you, is never final. No, you walk the path of one both blessed and cursed by the dragon, for the path you walk will never deviate from death, whether it be yours or those around you. Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, everyone in between and beyond, to Soul Searching for Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. In this video, I will examine the relationship I have with the game, my personal experiences with it, and any sort of life lessons I learned or ones that were reinforced by the game. I will then look into the souls of the developers to see what they had intended when they made the game, and whether or not they achieved their goals. So Sekiro was a game made by From Software, the same company who made the numbered Dark Souls games, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring. Though this game is a bit of a departure from those previously mentioned titles. I still remember the trailers when all we got to see was the bone that ended up being vital to the titular shinobi, and being really confused. There were huge rumors that this would be a remake or a sequel to Tenchu, and that I really had no interest in because I didn't play Tenchu. I'd never really experienced it myself. So the only interest for me was the fact that it was coming from Software. Then we discovered that it would be a brand new IP that had never been explored before. The boys and I were super excited, and the more we saw it, the less interested they got. Interestingly enough, Dark Souls had created this connection with builds and playing in the most ridiculous ways, which I've personally experienced, and when they discovered that you could not make your own character or equip new gear, their interest went way down. Mine did not wane as much though, because personally, I don't mind playing a predetermined character because I looked at it as something different from the Souls series. I didn't mind as much that it was in another Souls game. Then they announced the grappling hook and I got really interested because the new levels of verticality and traversal meant they could do a lot more interesting encounters and open the door for fun traversal mechanics throughout the rest of the game. This was also the time when everyone, and I do mean everyone, was putting in grappling hooks into their game, and I don't regret that. I don't hate that. Grappling hooks are never a bad addition unless they're trying to cover up for a bad game, which I'll be right up front, this was not. The anticipation builds, and finally the games are released, and then I realize I am terrible because I never really parried in the Souls games, and had not at the time played Bloodborne, which meant I had very little experience with parrying. Unlike the other games that I've covered on this show so far, I have not yet made a podcast episode about it, and I know that it won't come for a few months, but I promise you that I will be making one. I have gotten all achievements in the game, and I did it all a few years before I asked John about Dark Souls. I actually popped the last achievement on January 3rd in 2020, and at the time I had no ambitions of getting all the achievements in the Dark Souls series, but it was certainly one of the greatest feelings I had ever achieved. As of this recording, I have 50.6 hours in the game, but no intention of putting in any more anytime soon. I definitely bounced off the game harder than an enemy blade bounces off a perfect parry, because I was so unfamiliar with the game's mechanics, and really struggled with the timing even on the first enemy. So I put it down and did not come back for some time. Chris and John also had a similar experience to mine, claiming they didn't like the feel of the combat, and Chris had refunded the game, but John had at that time put too much into the game to do so. I believe he put in about 5 hours before really deciding, yeah, this was not for him. He has, as far as I'm aware, to this day, not finished the game and does not have any plans to do so, because he does not appreciate the game and how it deviated from its predecessors. Now, I understand that. I have come to learn in this year since it was released that this is not the kind of game for John. John, if he's going to get a Souls game, wants a Souls game. He will change the controls to be much more like a Souls game, or a traditional Souls game, I should say, from Software. Me, on the other hand, I have adapted in the sense that I have just kind of gone with whatever the developers want me to do in terms of control scheme or ideas. We even found out recently that he goes through the options extensively to kind of figure out, okay, what, do I want to mess around with here? How do I tailor this game experience to what I want? And me, I'm just like, unga bunga, press play. So I'm very simple in that regard, but I also feel like that leaves me open to a wider
a variety of experiences that I won't necessarily be as off-put by. I was admittedly surprised that we all had bounced off the game, and I'm kind of not sure why Chris did. I have come to learn why John did, and I understand why I did, but I also had this desire to come back to the game later and give it another shot, which thankfully I did. It was months until I came back, and for some reason, maybe it's the time away, maybe it was my determination to give the game another chance, I did. I picked it up, I played it, and it was then that the system really seemed to click for me, and it felt amazing. This had overtaken all the feelings of pride or accomplishment that I'd gotten from the numbered Souls titles, and that was on the first enemy. I have no idea what changed, and why for some reason I was having a much easier time with the parry windows, but it worked and I was overjoyed. I rode this momentum through the first few bosses, and the new mechanics that the game wanted me to learn. I learned a lot in these first few hours, but the most important takeaway was that you need to treat a game for what it is, not what you want it to be. This is not a case of, don't judge a book by its cover. It's a case of open the book with no expectations of what the book should be. Read the book, see what it has to say, and appreciate it for what it's giving you. Now, unlike Chris and John, I was okay with it not being more of a traditional Souls-like title, and to this day, the three of us disagree about the quality of combat, and I'm totally fine with that, because this is not a game for everyone. This was the game for me. Recently, Sean Heatherly commented that, at least for me specifically, the real treasure of the numbered Souls titles was actually the friends I made along the way. John and Chris are genuinely some of my best friends, and the times we've had playing the Souls games and so many other games were irreplaceable memories. But Sekiro was a game that I couldn't rely on them for. I had to pull myself up, I had to do this myself, without the possibility of help or that same sense of shared pain and community. In a way, I think it helped me to keep pushing because I didn't have someone to bounce off of with this game other than myself. As I said, no one else that I knew really played this game, so it was either pick it up and do it, or just move on, just stop, because no one can relate to the struggle that I'm going through. It made me take a good look in the mirror and wonder, is this something I want to? Is this something I'm having fun with? Is this something I am enjoying? The answer was yes, so I kept pushing, and I think it really helped cement me, my identity, with this game at the very least, around my own opinions, around just my own experiences, because I didn't have others' experiences or ideas pushing me. I didn't have John's enthusiasm or Chris's antics to make me come back to this game. And I don't want to, by any means, diminish the Souls titles, but for me, they are cooperative, play with friends affairs, whereas Sekiro, by nature, is not. And it was really weird that I was so into this. And with all that in mind, I worked and grinded through all the main and mini bosses. Unfortunately, there is not a series on John's channel because we didn't play together, so I can't link anything, and all the footage you're seeing now is of me playing the game again years later. So I'm very sorry, I will be terrible. The mechanics of the game are, in my opinion, so finely tuned that they allow for an expert to pull off some of the most flawless battles in the history of FromSoft. I was far from that then, I'm even farther from that now. But I felt this nagging urge, this nagging need to keep pushing. The story did feel kind of bland, but the feeling of combat and the adrenaline sent through my veins was addictive. I thankfully didn't have too much trouble with the first, third or half of the game, so to speak. Though it did provide a great level of challenge to encourage growth and, keep me coming back. I still vividly remember the first time I fought Gyobu Masataka Oniwa. I was in genuine awe for some reason, and I cannot to this day tell you why his introduction left such an impression on me, and the fight itself is burned into my memory, because I had to try to best him at least 6 times, and it felt better every time I was fighting him. There were obviously some boss fights that didn't give me the same feeling of wonder and awe, but the ones that did certainly felt awesome. If I had to point out, I would say the others would have to be the original Genichiro fight, Owl Father near the end of the campaign, and of course Ishin the Sword Saint, but I will get into those fights shortly. Sekiro is a game that's so finely tuned, finely designed around a singular idea, that I learned what I actually wanted from a game was not necessarily to make my own character and make my own fun or build out the character that I felt should be in this world. I wanted to play someone who was an established part of the universe. I wanted to play someone destined and designed to be part of this world. I wanted to play someone who is functionally a single note. like a one-trick pony. They do this one thing, but they do this one thing super well. And I learned that I don't have the same appreciation for the Souls titles after playing this game because I've experienced the other side. I've seen what it can provide me, and it's much closer to an experience that I actually want. Don't get me wrong, I do love the Souls titles, I always will. I've made countless videos on them, whether on, John's channel, mine, or whatever, and I will continue to make videos on them. But it's weird to me how my appreciation for those titles shifted after playing this one, and just why exactly it shifted. One of the key factors in this kind of shift in mindset was, as I mentioned just a few seconds ago, the boss fights. So I did want to kind of jump into a few of them. Like Genichiro actually stopped me for a long time and was the first time I had rage quit a game. Thankfully, I didn't break anything, I didn't throw my controller or anything, I didn't smash my desk. I just said, okay, I need to walk away. So I got up and I walked away and said, I'm done for now, I'll come back later. He definitely encouraged and helped me to reinforce the ideas of patience and persistence, as I would get way too heated in the middle of the battle and miss timings which I know I could have gotten. I was also learning and becoming a better player as the fights went on, because I was able to take a step back and learn, okay, I'm doing this wrong, I messed up here. I was able to start actually looking at what I was doing wrong and having the patience to understand, okay, this is how I can change that. I gained an appreciation for the adage of getting good, and this was certainly the most tangible it had ever been for me. Another thing that comes to mind is a meme that I'd recently seen going around from the Magic School Bus and Miss Frizzle saying, if at first you don't succeed, stop and figure out why. Don't just get up and try again. Figure out, okay, what went wrong? What can you do better? And then try that. It's a scientific method, and it makes perfect sense, and I get it's the dumbest thing. But it's all too easy to forget sometimes when you're in the heat of doing something or trying to get a task done. You don't take a step back and just think, okay, am I doing something wrong? Is there anything that I could be doing better to improve myself, to make this an easier task? Now, the other thing that comes to mind is work smarter, not harder. I have been a proponent of that, but I have never really followed through with it. I am the kind of guy who doesn't like to think, just puts his head down and does things the hard way when I don't have to, and I've frustrated a lot of people. My wife, to say the least, in that case. And she's really trying to push me to see the smarter way of doing things. And this is one of the few games that made me do the same, and yet I've forgotten that lesson quickly afterwards. But moving on. It was a similar feeling to a lesser degree with Owlfather, because by the time I fought him, I was well versed in the combat and had a few more upgrades. I'd learned and experienced, for one of the few times in my life, that feeling of utter calm. The word unfazed comes to mind, because there was never a doubt in my mind that I could beat him. This was the idea of an insurmountable challenge that didn't seem to exist to me anymore, and it was glorious. That was until the final boss of the game, Ishin the Sword Saint. This will forever live in my mind as arguably my favorite FromSoft boss fight of all time. Now, there are other bosses who I like more as a character or have more story importance, but this was always the standout fight in terms of mechanics for me. The lightning reflexes you need to react to some of the small tells really test you, and the variety of moves he has ensures that you use every skill in your arsenal to counter him. All this came to a head during the multi-stage fight that gets progressively more cinematic. Speaking of arsenal, that is actually one more aspect of the game I wanted to touch on. They move away from the traditional stat system towards a more skill tree, RPG light system with different abilities and the shinobi prosthetics. I really appreciated this because it meant that we were all on level playing field. There was no overpowered builds that you couldn't access or that require you to play a certain way. And in my opinion, it made for a much more interesting play experience than the previous Souls titles because of those reasons. This also felt a lot more skill-based and meant I wasn't chasing after bits of gear. I just had to master the different techniques available to me, which posed a more exciting challenge. It felt like it provided a lot more open-ended opportunities for various situations and didn't come down to making big numbers go even bigger. And I'm not gonna lie, the lack of PvP was definitely a bonus for me because I hate PvP. Combine all of that with the openness of the world and the opportunities afforded through that, and you have a much more customizable experience that really let me play around. It felt like I had more of the combat open to me over time, and it felt like a system where my skills could improve more than my stats, and that's what would make the difference in these encounters. So, enough about me. I want to talk about the developers. I want to see if they achieved the goals that they'd set out to, and what they had really envisioned when they started creating this game. Now, as per usual, I've looked through a number of interviews with the developers, as well as watched a number of YouTube videos that I will link in the description down below. Please go check them out if you're interested. With all that, let's get started. Started development around 2015, and what was interesting is they really wanted to move away from things like the Moonlit Greatsword, which actually doesn't feature in the game, and it's one of the few From Software games that it doesn't feature in, because they didn't want to feel too restricted, too closely tied to what they'd done in the past. They clearly set out to create a greater sense of freedom of movement and freedom of traversal, so that the player can feel like this world is really open to them. They can feel that new sense of verticality, and they can really approach things in different ways. They didn't want to put on restrictions on the player like they had in previous games. This is also part of the reason they got rid of the stat leveling system, because they were catering to different builds. So they have things that mages could use or strength users, but the problem was they were still specializing or focusing on just that area, like just that build. That meant they couldn't use every tool at their disposal. What they wanted here was a single character who could utilize every single tool that they were given, and it was up to the player to decide just how useful or when those tools should be used, because they're so multifaceted, because they can be used in so many different situations. It is arguably just the developer putting you inside of a larger box, but the box was so much larger that you don't really notice until you start really running up against those walls hours and hours later. They didn't necessarily try to make it more accessible than the Souls titles. They did want to make the arsenal and the tools more accessible so that people felt comfortable using a variety of different things to approach each situation. They wanted to avoid situations where, say, a boss can only be defeated using magic, or that magic proved to be the only thing that was ineffective against it, such as, say, the Smelter Demon from Dark Souls 2, or the fact that so many people just did, the run around and butt stab. They wanted better movement options and better combat options to really cut down on the number of people doing that, and add in more tension, add in another level of variety, or spice as they put it. In doing so, they tried to cater to each boss's characteristics and each character's unique traits and build a boss fight around those. What they think is going to be the most fun, and what they want the player to experience with this encounter. Miyazaki had also mentioned in one of the interviews, a small inspiration had been Hiroaki Samura's Blade of the Immortal, which is a manga that I've never personally read, though I will kind of maybe throw some screenshots up here, just to show you what has inspired him. He also claimed that it partially inspired Bloodborne, which is interesting. They also wanted to, again, pull away from the old Souls title of the corpse run and things like that, with things like the resurrection system, with things like you just losing half of your currency, because they did not want this game to be tied so closely to the Soulsborne titles. Miyazaki claimed that they were not intentionally trying to create Sekiro as an antithesis to the Souls games. He claims he loved the Souls games, and I absolutely believe him when he says that, but for him this had to be a new experience, a new way of playing that explored verticality, laterally, and just fresh, different ideas, so he could pull himself out of that mindset, that feeling that he's been under with the Souls titles for so long. This was him expressing his personal views in a new way to keep things fresh and interesting. That's partly why Miyazaki chose the katana to be the fixed primary weapon for the whole game. It allows the player and the developers to explore in depth how intricate you could make that combat system when you're focused solely on one weapon versus the handful of weapons that the opponents use. Yes, you do lose some customization, but in losing something, you gain so much more in terms of how much freedom you can give the player, especially when you add in all the shinobi tools. Honestly, I feel like they've achieved all these goals in creating an entirely new experience that feels unique from what they've made before. I also feel like they've reached their desired goals of giving the player a lot more freedom, not only in how they traverse the world, but how they approach combat, and each boss, for the most part, felt like their own person, especially. I think those things also stood out to me as the most important because by giving everyone the same tool set, you let them make their own strategies and solutions to the problem. I found it much more manageable while giving me this stronger sense of main character and the ability which is completely different than most other games that they have made, that I've played at the very least. The main bosses as well all felt way more unique than most of the Souls titles to me, because in those it was primarily a collection of monsters with hidden lore, but here it all seemed more cohesive on the surface level. This for me created a more interesting experience because I found a lot of other Souls titles have too many bosses that don't stand out or feel disconnected from the wider world, further establishing that it's its own IP and adventure to really let Miyazaki express his own ambitions apart from the past. So yeah, I really love this game. I can't wait to do a podcast episode on it, and I'm guessing this episode is going to turn out to be shorter than most of the others that have come out so far, but this is probably going to be closer to the average length of many of the soul searching videos, at least ones that don't involve videos on the channel that can talk about multiple playthroughs. So yeah, thank you everyone so much for being here, for listening to me ramble on another Souls title. I really appreciate it. I hope I can keep making these. It's a lot of fun. Alright, with all that being said, thank you, ladies, gentlemen, everyone in between and beyond for being here. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next one. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube stuff. Bye-bye!